We've written some functions already, but so far the functions we've written are not that interesting. They only do one thing, and there's no way to modify their behavior. Today we're going to understand how we can use arguments and parameters to send information to a function and modify its behavior. I have a modest program here. This program has two functions, of course the main function that we always have, but also a function called spam. And at this point, spam does the same thing with every run. It just prints out a single sentence. Let's run this to make sure it works so far. Looks good. But we would like to modify the spam function to make it a little more useful. And we will do that by adding a parameter. A parameter is a special variable that can be used inside the function. I will add the parameter how many and specify that the type of this parameter should be an integer. We'll come back and talk about that type later. Now let's split up this print function. We'll just print the first part of the sentence and then use the end argument to specify that we don't want a new line character. Then let's have a loop. Inside the loop, I'm just going to print the word spam. And again, I don't want a new line character. And then we'll end the sentence. This underscore character may confuse you, or perhaps throw you for a loop, when we want to loop through an action several times, but we don't really need to use the variable generated by range or some other iterable. We can use the underscore character. We could also use a variable name like I or something like that, but the underscore character signifies that we're not planning to use that variable. Now, we've used this variable how many, but we've never actually given it a value. How does how many get a value? I mentioned that how many is called a parameter for the function spam, and we fill that parameter by providing it as an argument when we call the function. So let's say we want spam to print 3 times. We'll provide the argument 3, and the argument fills in the variable value how many. So the value of how many becomes 3. Let's try this. Perfect. I mentioned that we'll come back to this type hint, int. When we write out the name of the function, PyCharm tells us what variables it's expecting. It's expecting something to fill this how many parameter. When I press parentheses, it tells me that how many should be an integer. And that hint comes from the fact that I typed the keyword int up here in the parameter list. This is called a type hint. It's relatively new to Python and it's not required, but you should use it in all your assignments. In fact, Python will not enforce this. If we pass a string instead of an int, it will try to run, but of course it'll run into problems later. So let's just demonstrate that we could change this to 10, and without changing any other part of our program, we change the behavior of the function. Just to reiterate, arguments and parameters have a relationship, but we want to be careful to use the vocabulary correctly. A parameter shows up in the signature of the function and represents a local variable that's going to be used inside that function. The argument is the actual value that will be used to fill in that parameter. The argument always shows up when we're calling the function. We could have 2 parameters. In fact, we can have as many as we like. So if we'd like to order something other than spam, that's not a problem. Of course, if we have 2 parameters in the function definition, we need to have 2 arguments in the call to that function. We want 10 orders of spam plus some eggs. I said that you have to provide 2 arguments, but that's not exactly true. We can make default arguments for any of these parameters. If we want the default to be eggs, we'd say other item equals eggs. If we provide a default argument, then we take the type hint out. PyCharm still knows what the type should be because you've named a string here. Notice that when we provide default arguments, we don't put any spaces around the assignment operator. Now I can still run my program listing the 2 arguments. I could change the argument that I pass, or I can leave that second argument out altogether, and it defaults to eggs. Note that I am still required to list how many. If how many also had a default argument, let's say 5. Then I could leave both arguments out of the list, and everything's fine. One thing though, we can't change the other item parameter by providing only that argument in the list. I'll get an error. The reason I got the error is because Python tried to place the eggs argument into the how many parameter. It can't guess where you wanted that to go. There are two ways to fix this. First, I could provide all of the arguments. In other words, I could put the 5 here, even though that's the default value. Then Python knows that 5 goes into the how many parameter and eggs goes into the other item parameter. But our whole point was to provide the default arguments so that we didn't have to do that. We can use the named parameter other item to specify which parameter this argument belongs to. We say other item equals eggs. Notice again that we're leaving no space around the assignment operator. And now this should work fine. We can change that to toast. And everything remains okay. It's possible that we would want to provide an arbitrary number of parameters here. For example, we might want to let the calling function order 7 different other items, or 20 or 37 items, and not know in advance how many items will be passed. We can do that. That's a little more advanced, and we'll talk about that later. One last thing. Remember that the docstring helps the user understand how to use the function. In order to make the docstring most useful, we should add the parameters. There are different ways to document your parameter list. Here's one possibility. We use args, then we'll name each argument that we expect, in parentheses the type of that argument, and a brief description. And we'll do it again for other item. And now our function is complete.